Today we're going to be talking about triggers. What triggers you to actually do something and follow through, and what may trigger you to stop in your tracks and completely lose motivation. Welcome back to another episode of the Upgrade My Rituals podcast. My name is Kevin McKellar, the host, and this is the show for stressed out overachievers who are looking to design the ideal day. So instead of being completely overwhelmed by all these new habits that they want to try to instill, we create the ideal day complete with systematic routines that are placed in inflection points throughout the day. So when you're finished and you go to sleep and your head hits that pillow, you feel great about what you've done and what you've accomplished and where you're headed. So if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. And if you like what you see, hit the like button and of course hit the bell notification so you can be notified of the next episode. But if you're already subscribed, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about triggers, and we're going to get into something that is basically another word for a cue. So you may be familiar with Charles Duhigg's work, The Power of Habit. That was a pretty substantial book in behavior change and developing habits. And then James Clear wrote The Atomic Habits, which was built upon this cue, routine, reward loop. So we're going to work on Charles Duhigg's three-step habit loop today. And we're going to basically, very, very simply before we get into it, break it down, right? We have the cue, we have the routine, which is basically the habit, and then we follow through to the reward. So for instance, if it's a smoking situation, you are cued to have a cigarette because either you are stressed out and you're needing that, your physical body needs the nicotine high, and coupled with the emotional stress. Or maybe you see a couple of other, people that smoke within the party or wherever you are in some social situation. They're going outside, so that may be the cue. And then we head over to the routine. The routine is the next step in this loop, where of course we, or I call it's called routine, but let's call it habit for today, and not to confuse how we look at routines in Upgrade. But we have the habit, and the actual habit is, taking a puff of the cigarette and smoking through. And then the reward is multiple things. We have, time outside to catch up with friends. We have obviously the nicotine high. We're relaxed, and it feels good. So that's a simple situation. Maybe it's the same thing, eating poorly, eating junk food. The cue is I drive by Taco Bell, and I'm obsessed with Taco Bell, right? So I drive by it. That's my cue because I'm headed home from work. And the routine or habit in this case is go ahead and get that quesalupi or whatever. And then of course the reward is I feel really, really good within about 5 to 10 minutes after I eat it. After that, we feel really, really bad. But that is, we can use the situation as many times as we want. What we're going to talk about today kind of is in line with that loop, and we're going to specifically build off of the context within how these cues can be kind of thrusted upon us. So we're going to talk about what I like to call triggers, and there are 3 different types of triggers that will have many, many different places and strategies within your ritual design. So there is the time-based trigger, there is the location-based trigger, and then there is the emotional-based trigger. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to put a pin in this in a second, and we're going to learn about these 3 triggers from the, I forget exactly which module, but one of the lessons in one of the modules of Day by Design, which is my program. So we're going to kind of dig into that in just a minute, but I want to give you just a little bit more context and how this works and how this fits into ritual design, because that is important. Ritual design is, again, a system of routines that are custom to you, but ultimately a system of our fundamental 4 routines, which you should be aware of that if you follow the show, the actuator, the clog, the keystone, and if you need a variable routine. So all these different types of routines, the 4 main ones throughout the day, and some things to help us and or things to watch out for that might hurt this progress and this momentum. Now, the thing is that there may be many times throughout the day that we are trying to enact behavior change for ourselves to become better version of ourselves. Because remember, there's no point in doing any of these routines if there's no positive outcome, right? The reason why we instill an AM routine is because we want to work out and meditate. The reason why we instill a PM routine is because we really want to make sure we spend some time with our family. XYZ, we can go down the list. So the whole point of this is to become better version of ourselves. But I recognize as important of a distinction between habit and routine is, I've built this entire program around routine over habit. I do understand that there are some times we're going to have either good or bad habits that enter our lives that can't necessarily be fit into a specific routine or can't be fit into the time that we're instilling that routine. So I'll give you an example. Road rage. Road rage is something I used to deal with. I really don't deal with much anymore because I've done this work. But that is a specific situation where something negative will trigger me. Someone cuts me off, and maybe even with cutting me off, the type of vehicle might even make me even more enraged that person chose to cut me off, whatever it may be. But there is no place for me to do anything about that trigger inside of ritual design. It happened randomly at 4:30 on the way home from work, or even more random, 2:30 on a Saturday when I was doing some errands. So there's sometimes not a place where we can use ritual design for every single situation, and that's why we have to make sure that we use and we understand the triggers in our lives and some situations on how to kind of leverage good tactics to either stop or encourage them, whether they be good or bad. So throughout the next couple of episodes, we are going to be touching on more tactical ways, for instance, environment design. We're going to talk about all ways revolved around really leaning into the location trigger. So we'll get more into that, but today's episode is basically to break down the time-based trigger, the location-based trigger, and the emotional-based trigger. So without further ado, let's take a listen into one of the lessons inside Day by Design. So we're going to take a look at 3 different triggers, and we're going to look at both the positive and negatives and how we can ultimately think about some of the things that we've been triggered negatively in the past before, as well as some of the positive triggers that we're going to ultimately input into our ritual design. So the first one we're going to talk about is a time-based trigger. So a time-based trigger is something that happens at a specific time of day. And again, I think the drive-through example is a really good example. At 5:30, you're driving home and you're hungry and you're tired and you're frustrated and it's 5:30. Right. So you're triggered because that's what you've been doing for years now, right? Okay, on the way home, I'll get myself a quesalupa or I'll get myself a cup of coffee, whatever it is, right? So that's the time trigger. Now, we can ultimately use this to our advantage. So a time trigger to ultimately help us and start our routines is really beneficial. So a lot of times I will, actually 2 of my routines, I have a voice activated device, Alexa, Lady A, if you will, and she helps me out. And that is a time trigger. And at, say, 4 o'clock, she starts my after work routine. And at 8:15, she starts my PM routine. And she says, here's a reminder, start your PM routine, right? And that's it. So it's a really easy way to use time on your side. Before we go on, let's take out your workbook and let's see an example of, if you can think of an example of a time of the day that has negatively affected you for some reason because you've established a bad habit. At the second token of that, let's think of a good time of day or a good trigger that you're going to enact at a specific time in order to help you either with your ritual design or do something specific like a block of time that you want to, practice guitar. The next trigger is a location-based trigger, and the location-based triggers can be tricky because they can kind of creep up on us. I'll give you an example. So every time I used to go to the mall, which is, I can't even remember last time I went to the mall, I would always have a craving for Auntie Anne's pretzels. Those were my kryptonite, right? And every time we go to the mall, we'd always get Auntie Anne's pretzels. Auntie Anne's pretzels are not necessarily part of my weight loss plan, so that could be a problem, right? Ultimately, I want to recognize that as my negative location. So every time I even drive by the mall, that's kind of like, in the back of my mind, which may then trigger me to get some type of bad fast food or something like that. A positive location trigger can be something that you do obviously when you are somewhere or do something that can necessarily be part of your routines. It doesn't have to be. For instance, it could be something that every time that you pull up to your house, you can do something called the problem tree. And the problem tree is a little exercise that I do. I don't necessarily do it all the time, but it's not necessarily part of a ritual that I've put into place. But what I'll do is I'll look at a tree that we have right in the front of the house. It's like a center point of the whole yard, and any problems that I have, any emotional problems that I have with clients or work or whatever it may be, I don't want to bring that home into my family. So I'll literally mentally go through the process of hanging up my problems on the problem tree, and that way it's outside. It's there for me when I need it. And whenever I come back out, I can deal with my problems. But when I go back inside and I, spend time with my wife and my kid, I'm not gonna push any of those problems on them. So take some time. We're gonna figure out a negative trigger that you might have had in the past, maybe not, but might have had when you arrived somewhere. Maybe it was the town you grew up in, or maybe it was your high school you went to, and every time you drive by, you have negative emotions. Therefore, you do X, Y, and Z, and some of the positive things that you might want to enact in your program for a location trigger. So if it's the problem tree, if it's something else where anytime you pass by, right? If you pass by a fish store or something like an aquarium or anything like that, you think of your grandpa because you used to go fishing with, I don't know, something like that. But something that if you want to enact the location trigger, something positive for your routines. The last trigger we're going to talk about is the emotional triggers. Now, the emotional triggers are probably the most common, right? Because they can happen anywhere at any time. And you and I are both emotional beings because we're human. That's what makes us different, right? Than many of the species, on the earth. So, what is an emotional trigger? Well, here's one that I think many of us can relate to, and it's one of my things that I consistently work on, and that is road rage. That's getting cut off by somebody and losing your mind, right? You're driving and it's a nice sunny day, and someone just comes in and just for no reason, just comes right in front of you, right? First thing is, why, right? Second thing is, oh my God, right? And you go through this whole spiraling effect. Okay. So that clearly is a negative, trigger that we have, I think we can all relate to in some way. What you can do in this case, you can do a combination of a few things. You can enact a positive trigger that will ultimately be in place of that negative emotional trigger, or you can preemptively have a location trigger. So I'll explain it. I might have explained this before previously in another module, but one of the ways that I was working on my road rage was before I would get in the car, I would put some type of trigger in the vehicle. So it used to be a rubber band around the stick shift. I then was doing a Post-it note on the backup camera, so I know I would have to remove it to see the camera. And that process was the location trigger to then move me into an emotional state and say, I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful to have family. I'm grateful to, have all these things. And I'm now going to be operating a 2,000-pound death machine. I am, I have that responsibility, and I'm going to drive super, super safe. And I am not going to put a meaning towards anybody who cuts me off. And that's one of the most important things in this situation. If somebody is racing and cuts you off, there could be a million different things happening. It may not mean that person doesn't like you or wants to harm you. It may mean that somebody's sick at the hospital and they're racing towards them. It may mean that they are having a really, really bad day and they look down at their phone quickly or whatever it is. Like, who knows? It's still unacceptable, but do not associate the meaning to it. Therefore, you will be less likely to have the emotional trigger because it'll just be a fight or flight physical response, and you will not be coupling that with an emotional trigger. It'll take practice, like anything. Like you learning the guitar, it's going to take many, many times of practice and diligent exercise and failing at this ultimately. But as you can see, these triggers are the gray area between routines and habits. Because again, part of this process is recognizing the importance of building habits. I understand that. We can't solve everything with a routine. I'm not going to, every time somebody cuts me off, have the emotional trigger to then start a routine and go over to the side of the road and do 10 minutes of breathing and a 10-minute meditation. It's not going to work. All right. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope your mind and your wheels are turning regarding these types of triggers, and maybe you're already seeing some areas in your life where you can kind of at least get a hold of them and be aware of them is really the first step. If you liked this and if you thought this was interesting, that is a very, very microscopic smidge into my program Day by Design. And if you're interested in joining one of the next upcoming cohorts, definitely check out Day by Design on the website. I will leave a link in the show notes. Depending on when you're listening to this, the current cohort may not be open, so you may have to jump on the waiting list. But definitely check that out. And of course, if you like this video, hit like, subscribe, which would be great. And then, of course, the bell notification so you'll be notified of the next episode. And with that being said, thank you so much for listening and being here. And I will see you next week on the Upgrade My Rituals podcast.